There is a kind of loneliness that wears the mask of life itself. It breathes quietly, like a ghost between conversations, hidden behind the echo of laughter, behind the brightness of screens, behind the gentle insistence of words like, "I've just been busy." It moves unseen through rooms filled with sound and light, and yet it remains untouched. An ache that hums beneath the skin, steady as a heartbeat you forget to notice. It is not the loneliness of an empty room, nor the silence of solitude chosen. It is the slow, invisible kind, the kind that blooms behind the eyes of people who are surrounded but unseen, who speak but are never really heard. It's the loneliness of realizing that no one knows your inner landscape, that if you vanished into the folds of time, the world might take a while to remember you existed at all. There's a certain grief in that realization, quiet, dignified, but devastating all the same. Because the truth of being human is this: we ache to be witnessed, not admired, not even loved at first, but seen. To have someone's gaze fall upon our existence and say, "I recognize you. I see your shape in the dark." And when that recognition never comes, the silence grows, roots. It spreads through thought and movement, altering everything it touches, the way we walk, the way we hold ourselves, the way we imagine what we deserve. People mistake this kind of solitude for coldness. They call it indifference, shyness, apathy. But more often, it's the opposite. It's the soul that feels too much, the heart that listens so deeply it begins to drown in every nuance, every tremor in another's voice, every false smile that trembles like glass. These people, those who seem withdrawn, are often the ones who once stood too close to the flame of connection and burned quietly. They loved without armor. They believed without caution. They opened the door too wide, too early, and learned what happens when the world does not walk through. There's something the mind does after that, a soft retreat, not into bitterness, but into self-preservation. It begins to equate closeness with danger, vulnerability with pain. The body learns to tighten when approached. The heart learns to fold its wings. Science gives names to these things. It calls it social pain, learned helplessness, isolation-induced threat response. But language, even dressed in the precision of academia, can't quite capture the feeling of lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, realizing that no one is thinking of you. No one will text. No one will knock. No one will notice the absence of your light in their sky. The brain, ancient and tribal, cannot tell the difference between emotional exile and physical harm. It interprets silence as danger, solitude as starvation, and so the lonely heart beats like prey, fast, watchful, restless. You begin to scan for signs of rejection before they appear. You see disinterest in every pause, disappointment in every delayed reply. It's not paranoia. It's evolution turned against itself. We were built to belong, and when belonging disappears, the mind becomes a wilderness that devours its own echoes. Yet the modern world has made this disconnection easy, almost elegant. We speak to hundreds through screens but touch no one. We share images, not intimacy, attention, not understanding. You can scroll through oceans of faces and still feel like you're drowning alone. Because validation is not the same as love, and recognition is not the same as being known. Those who've lived without friendship long enough carry a certain quietness about them, a poise that looks like peace, but is really practiced containment. They tell themselves they prefer solitude, and for a time they might. Because solitude, when newly discovered, feels clean. It's the calm after the storm, the silence after the noise of too many almost connections. But solitude has seasons too, and what begins as healing can slowly harden into habit, until one morning you wake up and realize that peace has turned into isolation, and freedom into exile. It's a slow erosion, this kind of loneliness. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It just empties you, grain by grain. You start talking to yourself in thoughts that loop endlessly. You replay moments, what you said, what you didn't say, what might have changed if you'd said it differently. You dissect silence like a scientist studying an extinct species, and in doing so, you become the echo of your own existence. Sometimes you convince yourself you like it that way, that the quiet is safer than the mess of people. And perhaps for a while it is. But safety, too, can become its own kind of danger. There's a point where protection becomes prison, where the walls you built to keep pain out also keep love from getting in. And yet you don't tear them down, because you've forgotten what it feels like to live without them. The mind adjusts. It always does. It tells you stories. You're just different. You're independent. You don't need anyone. But beneath the logic, something in you still yearns to be mirrored, to be understood, to rest inside the warmth of another consciousness that says, you don't have to explain. And yet, the ache persists, gentle, persistent, like an unplayed note that vibrates beneath everything you do. You go through the motions of life, answering emails, brushing your teeth, walking through crowded streets. And all the while, that quiet dissonance hums behind the surface, as if the soul itself were whispering, "This isn't how it was meant to be." There are people who mistake this ache for weakness. They say, you need to put yourself out there. You need to be more social. As if connection were something you could manufacture through willpower alone. But those who've lived inside long winters of isolation know the truth. The barrier is not external. It is not the world that refuses you. It is the mind that no longer believes it is safe to be seen. Over time, the inner voice grows louder than the world itself. You begin to narrate your life from a distance, like a spectator watching a film whose plot feels eerily familiar, but whose protagonist you no longer fully recognize. That's the strange thing about being unseen for too long. You start to disappear from your own story. Not suddenly, but through 1,000 small withdrawals. You stop reaching out first. You stop sharing things that matter. You edit yourself down until even your reflection feels like a summary. And when someone asks, "How are you?" you answer, "I'm fine," because that's the only version of truth you can say without trembling. Some nights, you scroll through memories instead of messages. You look at old photographs and wonder when exactly you stopped being real in other people's lives. And in that wondering, there's a quiet grief that feels older than language itself. Psychologists call it learned social helplessness, the moment when the heart decides that trying again isn't worth the pain of being unseen again. But it's not just psychology. It's poetry written in the nervous system, a biological elegy for connection lost. And yet, even within that numbness, the longing never fully dies. It just changes shape. It becomes observation. Those who have no friends often see the world with piercing clarity. They notice everything. The flicker in someone's eyes before they look away, the way laughter falters halfway through, the invisible tremors between words. They are the quiet witnesses of human life, They see the gaps between gestures, the fractures behind smiles, the truth beneath performance. And maybe that's why connection feels both sacred and terrifying to them. Because they see too much of its fragility. They know that intimacy is not a guarantee. It's a delicate alignment of souls, a small miracle that can vanish without warning. Sometimes they find peace in solitude. They build rituals, morning coffee in silence, late walks beneath dim streetlights, books that feel like conversations. They learn to hold themselves gently, like their own companions. But deep down, even peace can ache, because no amount of self-sufficiency can replace the feeling of another heartbeat near your own. Time, too, becomes different when you live without witnesses. Days lose their edges. Moments blur. Birthdays and weekends lose meaning because they are defined by the absence of someone to share them with. Minutes stretch, hours dissolve. The clock becomes less a measure of life and more a reminder of its quiet passing. There's a strange elasticity to lonely time. It expands, it echoes. You begin to live more inside memory than in motion. You start to measure life not by events but by thoughts. And when the inner world becomes louder than the outer, reality itself begins to thin. But solitude is not always the enemy. When entered with awareness, it can become a teacher. There is a solitude that wounds, yes, but there is also one that heals. The difference lies in intention. Chosen solitude is sacred space. Forced solitude is exile. One reveals the self, the other erases it. Those who've lived too long in isolation hover between both. They say, "I like being alone," and for a while it's true. But beneath that statement lies a softer one they rarely say aloud. "I just don't trust being held anymore." Friendship, after all, is not just social exchange, it's reflection. It is the mirror through which we confirm our own existence. Without it, identity frays. You begin to question whether you are still the same person you once were, or whether you've become a ghost of who you might have been if someone had truly stayed. There's a certain kind of invisibility that isn't about being ignored but about existing without echo. You speak, but the words fall flat, absorbed by silence. You laugh, but no one joins you. You create, but no one bears witness. And slowly you begin to vanish into your own transparency. That is the quiet tragedy of people without friends. Not the solitude itself, but the absence of recognition. To exist without witness is to drift without anchor, to breathe without resonance. And yet, here lies the paradox. Those who've known deep loneliness often become the gentlest souls alive. Because they know the ache of invisibility, they see others with extraordinary clarity. They notice the overlooked. They check in softly without fanfare. They give warmth without demand. They become the very thing they once longed for: presence. Perhaps that is the secret meaning of this exile. That loneliness, when endured long enough, refines empathy. It sculpts the heart into something vast and tender. But empathy without outlet is its own kind of burden. You carry so much feeling with nowhere to pour it. You become a reservoir of emotion that no one drinks from. There comes a moment, quiet, inevitable, when you realize that waiting to be found will never be enough. That maybe the path back to connection begins, not with being seen, but with remembering yourself. Because friendship cannot take root in the soil of self-forgetfulness. It needs the light of self-trust. And if you've lived too long in the dark, you must first become your own sunrise. You begin to speak to yourself differently, less like a critic, more like a companion. You answer your own thoughts gently. When the mind says, "No one cares about you," you reply, I am learning to care. When it whispers, you'll always be alone, you breathe, I'm still open to being found. This is how healing begins, not in noise, but in subtle recalibrations of thought. Neural pathways bend toward light, one repetition at a time. You begin to soften toward the world again. You start saying yes, not out of fear of missing out, but out of quiet curiosity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift. The silence that once felt heavy begins to breathe. The walls you built no longer feel like protection, but like places you can open windows through. The air changes. You notice how sunlight lingers differently on your hands, how strangers smile a little longer than before, how even your own footsteps sound less hollow. It is not that the loneliness vanishes, it simply learns to speak a different language. Because the truth is, we never really escape loneliness. We only learn to translate it. We turn it into art, into words, into quiet acts of kindness. We turn it into a rhythm, a way of moving through the world that says, I have known emptiness, but I am still here, still reaching. And in that reaching, there is beauty. Not the loud, cinematic kind, but the kind that hums beneath things, the way dust dances in a beam of light, the way a sigh can sound like forgiveness. You start to realize that perhaps the purpose of loneliness was never to punish you, but to prepare you, to hollow out the spaces where connection will one day live. It's strange how the human spirit works. You can spend years believing you are beyond repair, and yet the moment someone looks at you with real softness, something ancient inside you stirs. Recognition, that deep, wordless remembering. Oh, this is what it means to be seen. But before that moment arrives, there is the long apprenticeship of solitude. The slow process of learning yourself, not as a role or reflection, but as a living being, layered and infinite. You begin to see your own sensitivity not as flaw, but as instrument, finely tuned to the frequencies of life itself. You start to understand that being too much was never the problem. It was just that the world around you was often too afraid of depth. And maybe that's why you withdrew, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. When the world doesn't know how to hold the tenderness you carry, you learn to hold it yourself. But over time, that holding can become hoarding. Your heart, a museum of unsaid things. And so you begin the work of unlearning protection, the slow art of becoming reachable again. You practice vulnerability in small, trembling doses. You meet the eyes of the cashier. You let a conversation linger past its comfort zone. You reply to messages without rehearsing the perfect tone. You risk being awkward, unfinished, real. Because the truth is, connection doesn't come from mastery. It comes from presence. No one needs your perfection. They need your humanity. They need the quiet honesty of your presence, the unpolished rhythm of your voice. They need to see you trying, even if your hands still shake. Over time, those gestures begin to build bridges, fragile at first, then stronger, then sacred. And one day, maybe in the least expected place, a cafe, a train, a shared silence, you meet someone who speaks in the same emotional dialect. There's no need for translation. They look at you, and in that gaze, something in both of you exhales. That is how friendship begins. Not in performance, but in mutual recognition. A soft, wordless, "You too? I thought I was the only one." Loneliness teaches you to cherish what others take for granted. It trains your senses to notice the sacred in the ordinary. the way laughter sounds when it's genuine, the way a conversation can feel like sunlight breaking through an overcast mind, the way silence, when shared, feels less like emptiness and more like understanding. Those who have walked through long corridors of isolation know how to sit with others' pain without flinching. They have seen the dark, so they are not afraid of it. They know how to hold space for silence, how to listen without needing to fix, how to love without possession, and in that quiet strength lies their redemption. Because the same sensitivity that once felt like a curse becomes, in time, the source of connection. Empathy, once sharpened by loneliness, turns into clarity. You begin to see that everyone, yes, everyone, is carrying their own quiet ache. Some hide it in noise, some in ambition, some in laughter. But beneath it all, there is the same ancient yearning, to be seen, to be held, to belong. And perhaps that's the great cosmic joke, that none of us are truly alone in our loneliness, that even in isolation, we are still part of humanity's invisible thread, woven together by longing. Every heartbeat, even the solitary one, echoes somewhere in another. In time, you learn to walk differently, not toward people in desperation, but toward life itself, with a kind of openness that says, I am ready again. Ready not just to be found, but to find. Ready to be surprised by kindness, to be touched by chance. You stop chasing validation and start noticing connection in subtler forms. The warmth in a stranger's greeting, the gentleness in a friend's pause, the way the world seems to lean closer when you stop resisting it. There's a moment, unpredictable and pure, when the old loneliness finally softens. Not because it disappears, but because you no longer fight it. You accept it as part of your inner weather, a season that comes and goes. And in that acceptance, you find something resembling peace. You realize that being alone does not mean being unloved, that solitude in its quiet truth is not a punishment, but a passage, that every unanswered text, every night spent in silence, every ache of invisibility was carving you into someone who could hold real intimacy without losing yourself in it. You start to see your life not as a sequence of absences, but as preparation, a slow becoming. And when the right people finally appear, you will meet them not with hunger, but with presence, not asking to be filled, but ready to share, because you've learned the language of your own soul, and that fluency makes connection sacred. And when that moment comes, that quiet, almost imperceptible crossing from solitude into connection, it does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives like dawn, slowly, silently, a soft light spilling across the edges of your inner horizon, touching the places you thought would never feel warmth again. You might not even notice it at first. The ease in your laughter, the gentleness in your posture, the way you begin to look people in the eyes again without fear. And then one day, in a cafe or a park or in the quiet intimacy of an ordinary conversation, you realize you are no longer performing yourself. You are simply being. No rehearsed tone, no curated version, no translation between your thoughts and your words. You speak, and the world answers, not with applause, but with understanding. And in that exchange, something ancient and tender awakens inside you. This is what it means to belong. Belonging is not loud. It is not a room filled with voices. It is the feeling that you can finally exhale. It's the subtle awareness that you are seen not for your surface, but for your stillness. That someone recognizes the quiet architecture of your being and calls it home. When you've known the ache of invisibility, belonging feels holy. It humbles you. It teaches you that presence, not perfection, is the real form of love. That you don't need to shine to be seen, you only need to show up unmasked. And that's the secret the lonely eventually learn, that the opposite of loneliness isn't company, it's connection. The kind that doesn't demand explanation, that lets silence speak, that welcomes the truth of who you are, without needing it to be smaller, lighter, easier. Those who have lived in long winters of solitude know that friendship, real friendship, is not built through constant noise, but through resonance. Through those unspoken moments when two souls align like tides, meeting in moonlight. It is less about conversation and more about recognition. A gentle nod between two worlds that say, "You too? I thought I was the only one." And once you've known that, the whole world looks different. You stop trying to be interesting and start being interested. You stop craving attention and start noticing life's quiet gestures. The kindness of a stranger, the texture of rain against glass, the fleeting courage of someone smiling through their own pain. Loneliness, when survived, becomes an instrument of perception. You begin to see how fragile everyone's bravado is, how each person you pass carries their own invisible ache. And instead of envy, you feel empathy. Instead of resentment, compassion. Because you know what it's like to be unseen, and now you never want anyone else to feel that way. That's how loneliness transforms you, not into a cynic, but into a seer. It teaches you to recognize the sacredness of attention, how offering your presence to another person is, in its own way, a form of salvation. There will still be days when the old ache returns, when silence feels heavy again, when the world seems distant and your own mind echoes too loudly. But even then you'll know the difference now, that emptiness is not absence, but space. Space to breathe, to create, to listen, to wait. You'll learn that solitude can coexist with love, that silence can hold meaning, that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. You'll start to walk with a different rhythm, slower, steadier, no longer rushing toward noise, but moving in harmony with quiet. You'll find beauty in the in-between, the empty streets at dusk, the sound of your own footsteps returning your existence back to you. And one day, you might meet someone else who has walked through their own loneliness, someone whose silence feels familiar, whose eyes hold the same soft stillness as yours. You won't need many words. Your hearts will recognize each other like old travelers who finally found the same shore. And in that moment, the years of isolation will begin to make sense. You'll understand that solitude was never wasted time. It was the forging of depth, that it shaped you into someone who could love without possession, who could listen without judgment, who could sit in another's silence without needing to fill it. That's what loneliness was teaching you all along, how to be human with reverence, how to touch the world gently, how to understand that every soul you meet is a story still unfolding, carrying its own quiet hope of being known. The world, after all, is full of invisible threads. We are all connected, even when we forget. Every thought of kindness, every act of presence, every shared glance between strangers weaves a tapestry we cannot see but deeply feel. And sometimes, the simplest gestures become the most profound bridges. A smile on a rainy morning, a nod from across the street, a shared moment of stillness that says, "We're both here. We're both trying." That's the quiet miracle of existence. even in your loneliest moments, you have never been truly alone. Every breath you take belongs to the same rhythm that moves through everyone else. Every ache you feel is mirrored somewhere in another heart. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. That collective heartbeat beneath all the noise, whispering softly, "You are part of this. You always were." Perhaps this is what it means to heal, not to erase loneliness, but to let it become a part of your music. To carry it not as a wound, but as an instrument tuned to empathy. To realize that the purpose of pain was never to destroy you, but to deepen your capacity to love. Because loneliness, in its quietest truth, is not the absence of connection. It is the longing for authenticity. It is the soul's way of remembering what it was made for: to touch, to witness, to be seen. And when you finally meet that, in another person, in a moment of stillness, in the reflection of your own eyes, you'll know that everything before was not emptiness, but preparation. All the quiet nights, all the unanswered messages, all the invisible years, they were shaping you, sharpening your perception, softening your edges, teaching you how to stay open even after breaking. Until at last, you become the kind of person who can sit beside another human being and say, without words, "I see you. You are not alone." And maybe that's where every great story begins. Not in noise, not in crowds, but in the meeting of two silences that decide, together, to listen.